Welcome to this interview of machine learning expert Ahmed Ares that was conducted on October 24th, 2024. The conversation starts with us getting our feet wet and Ahmed defining concepts like machine learning, large language models, and fine-tuning. Another topic that Ahmed and I discuss is the context-based machine translation that generative AI models make possible. We consider the data science behind the application of Gen AI for specific use cases. Ahmed also tells us about his interest in localization and the automated localization quality assurance models that he's building at his startup, Native. Finally, Ahmed shares what he looks for when hiring for startup teams and gives some final advice on the adoption of AI in translation and localization. Ahmed Ares is a distinguished expert in machine learning and artificial intelligence with a unique background that spans multiple industries. He began his career at Revolut, where he was one of the first members of the computer vision team, developing crucial features like selfie authentication and document verification. He then joined Heron Data as a founding engineer, where he wore multiple hats from machine learning to product development and sales. More recently, he worked as a senior machine learning engineer at XYZ Reality, where he pioneered the integration of AI and augmented reality in the construction industry. Ahmed is now working on LQA automations at his own startup, Native. He brings a wealth of knowledge in applying machine learning to solve real-world problems across various industries. We're excited for you to hear Ahmed's insights on the application of machine learning to translation and localization. Let's go to the conversation that Ahmed and I had now.
So it's just such a pleasure to have you here to talk with us today about machine learning and localization. Thank you so much, Ahmed.
My pleasure.
We'll dive right in. For our audience who may be unfamiliar with machine learning, could you briefly explain what it is and how it differs from traditional programming?
Yeah, of course. So machine learning is essentially how do you teach a model to achieve a certain outcome. The easiest way to explain this is through what we call supervised learning. So for example, if I'm a teacher and I'm going to try to teach you how the difference between a cat and a dog, I will show you different images. This is a cat, this is a dog, this is a cat, this is a dog. And at some point, you won't need my input anymore. You will by yourself be able to say what is a cat and a dog. So that's really what's behind machine learning, is how do you show multiple examples. This can be images, can be videos, can be text, to a certain model, and the model will learn to recognize the pattern and then will be able to output by itself, the desired outcome that you wanted to teach. Today, when people talk about artificial intelligence, it's mainly machine learning. LLMs is mainly machine learning. Everything is machine learning. It's just we use different words for it. And programming is a way to reach the machine learning. So you program machine learning models. So it's actually quite different because one leads to another.
I think it's interesting too, because I talk quite a bit in terminology about when fields are sort of new, and I understand machine learning isn't new per se.
Yeah.
It's sort of captured people's imagination very recently. And so when that happens, terminology tends to be used very inconsistently, and it's not really clear what people are talking about when they use terminology. So I appreciate that explanation. Could you give a simple example of what large language models are and how they work then, and like how generative AI works?
Yes, of course. So everything that people use nowadays, whether it's ChatGPT and Claude, etc., they are what we call large language models. So LLMs, to make it short. Actually, if you come to think about what large language models are, they're very easy to explain. It's just a mathematical function. You can think about it as a mathematical function, which takes a certain input, which is what you write to ChatGPT in this case, and it tries to predict with a certain probability what is the best word to show. So every time it will output a word, and then it will define what is the best word to use after that context, after whatever it has written. And the way they are created is they are trained on an immense amount of data. So for example, in this case, for example, GPT-4 has been trained on the entire internet. So if, for example, you say, the cat ate the cheese, it is a sentence that is a bit more, let's say, out there, that is more accepted than, for example, the roof is the fire. The roof is the fire doesn't make any sense. Yeah. How does the large language model know that? Is because it has been trained on the internet. In the internet, it has seen sentences such as the cat ate the cheese versus like the roof ate the mouse, ate whatever, the fire. So that's how it knows what's good versus what's bad. It's been trained on the internet. Now, if tomorrow somehow we discover that the internet's data is 80% bad, then LLM's output will be 80% bad. So it's really the quality of LLMs is directly proportional to the quality of the training data. And every machine learning model that we build, it's directly proportional to the quality of the data. So if tomorrow I come and say, this is a cat versus this is a dog, but actually the dog is a cat and the cat is a dog, you will start being like, oh, well, I don't know which one is a cat and a dog anymore. It's exactly the same thing, right? It is as good as the data it has been trained on.
So when I'm using like Cloud 3.5 or ChatGPT, I can call those either LLMs or generative AI assistants?
Correct. LLMs are just part of generative models. So generative models have LLMs, but they have also other things such as image generation, video generation, audio generation, right? LLMs is just a subset of generative models.
Okay. Yeah. And what are some common applications of machine learning that people might encounter in their daily lives and in translation in localization?
Okay, let's start. Maybe a simple one for machine learning. Okay, so if you scroll into Instagram, right? If you use Instagram or use Facebook, how does Instagram monetize? They monetize to ads, right? They monetize to ads because they see what you've been doing and they show you ads. It's what we call targeted ads, right? Yeah. Every time you scroll and you, for example, let's say you look at a post, for example, in TikTok does this very well. Every time you look at a post, it looks at how long you spent time looking at that post. That goes into a machine learning model to predict what you like. So if you spend 5 seconds watching a video of bags versus 20 seconds watching a video of cats, it will know that you prefer cats versus bags, right? Cats are better for you. Therefore, there's going to be a real-time ML model that is trained to tell the model that chooses the ads, hey, this person prefers cats. You should show this person cat products, for example, right? Yeah. So these are like, it's actually, we use ML every single day. We are the product of ML systems, it's just people don't know about it, right? In the context of localization, real-time translation is probably right now the hot topic, I would say, of like generative AI, right? So Mark Zuckerberg recently showcased their new AR augmented reality glasses that they wanna release in 2027, and one of the big features that they showed there was, hey, you can do real-time translation. For example, I am wearing something, I can see a banner in Japanese, I can see it in real time instead of Japanese in English because I speak English, right? Yeah. That's gonna be one of the really that I see real-time translation, breaking language barriers is gonna be where I believe AI is gonna play a big role in localization.
It will change completely the kinds of jobs that translators have too, where I think about the eBay model, where what eBay does is they have language leads who it's their job to train the machine translation engines on a very, very high level because they've got so much user-generated content coming in that they couldn't translate it from scratch. Having a human do it manually, it's just not feasible. Right. It won't make economic sense. And so it seems like with what you're saying, like Zuckerberg is doing, and with these real-time translation models as well, it's going to be humans looking at the outputs on a very high level to try to kind of correct things and guide the models to be producing translations that are accurate and complete and all of those things.
100%. So LLMs, so if you think about traditional machine translation models such as DeepL and Google Translate, they are good. LLMs to some extent do a better job because they've been trained on more data and they have more context. For example, LLMs know that you cannot say a certain thing in a particular country. They will not know everything, but they will have more context than just like Google Translate or DeepL. And that's where I believe LLMs will play a big role in localization, is because of the context awareness, right? Today, LLMs are at a level of a junior translator, right? It's only a matter of time until it gets better. But I do always believe that there's going to be some level of human input because it's going to be very hard for LLMs to capture really cultural nuances. And for example, in the context of localization for movies, games, for example, you want to preserve the artist's work. Humor, for example, is going to be extremely hard to localize properly. So there has to be a human level. It's human looking at the output. Now, the question is more like, how much does the human have to intervene? Maybe today it's like 50%. In the future, it might be just 20% or 10%. And so the human has more time to do other things, right? But it's going to be an extremely interesting decade ahead. Yeah.
I agree. And I think where, translators get a little bit scared when they hear numbers like, oh, your translation work is going to be reduced down to 10%. But I was just talking recently about a presentation I saw back in like 2014, where the speaker completely changed my views about machine translation, because he's like, listen, there's more content being produced on the internet every single day than there are human translators available to translate it. And to the point that we maybe have like enough human translators to translate 1%, or like just such a small number, a small percentage of the content being produced, we have enough people to do the translation for. And so I don't think people should feel scared about like, oh no, I'm not going to have work anymore because the generative AI systems are going to take my job. No, they're not. They're just going to make it possible for us to translate a much higher volume of content.
100%. I fully agree with that, right? I come from a country where not many people speak English. I come from Tunisia, and it's sad for me that my friends who don't speak English that I know cannot consume the same amount of knowledge or information or content the same way that I do because I speak English.
Yeah.
And so if you think about it this way, suddenly like technology will be able to give them access to this information and knowledge, right? And humans can just like translate maybe we can assume like, 10 or 20% of a particular content, but so much more content suddenly, right?
Yeah.
And so I don't actually believe that it's going to take over completely everything, right? It's not true.
Silvio Piccinini just gave a really awesome presentation at SlaterCon about the fact that just looking at what's preferable, if we're looking at machine translation engines versus generative AI for doing translation, exactly as you were saying, he talks about the fact like when we were working with statistical machine translation, the context that the machine could have was like 5 words. And then in Israel, the context became like a sentence or 2 sentences. And then we get to generative AI where the context is like all of the internet and every single person who has produced content on the internet. So that presentation excited me so much because it takes us from words-based, like when I say words-based translation to semantics-based translation, it takes us from this activity of just like having words as dead things, just like combinations of letters that a machine is looking at, putting the combination of letters in order according to probability, to semantics-based translation where the generative AI model can understand meaning more.
Right.
I just wondered if you could talk about that. Like, can AI models understand meaning? How does that work?
Okay, so the answer is yes and no at the same time. So models, machine learning, ultimately, and generative AI is just a mathematical function. It's just a huge mathematical function. When you hear 700 billion parameter that people say, it means it's just a mathematical function containing 700 billion numbers, right? And so what I talked about earlier about how LLMs actually work at a very high level, it's the probability of finding the next best word given a certain context. Now, if, for example, I give a dialogue to statistical machine translation, and it's just a dialogue, it won't know who's speaking, what the relationship between the two people is, right? But the relationship between two people in certain cultures matters a lot. So, in French, for example, the way you speak to an adult and the way you speak to someone that is of the same age, you use different words. The adult, you say vous. Someone of the same age, you say tu. So statistical machine translation or machine translation that we talk about cannot capture that. So suddenly you give it a dialogue, it won't know the gender, it will not know the relationship. Where generative AI models comes in is, hey, you can give it that. You say, for example, this is a conversation between, A and B, A is the son of B. Now here's the dialogue. So
Hmm.
when it's gonna try to find the when it's gonna translate, and it's gonna see that A is speaking because it knows, and it has a relationship on A and between A and B, the probability that it says vous instead of tu, for example, if you're speaking between between a mother and a son, let's say,
Yeah.
is gonna pick vous instead of tu because it knows the relationship, right? And so this is a concrete example about how generative AI will be different from machine translation, right? Capturing that context. And what happens under the hood is it knows, it has understood the relationship because it represented the relationship as a vector, as a vector of numbers. And it's like, okay, so I have been trained on the internet. I know through the internet that when it's a mother and a son, you don't use tu, you use vous. Therefore, I will pick vous.
Yeah.
But machine translation, there is no, it cannot know that, right? And so that's where I believe the big leap is going to happen is context awareness.
Hmm.
If you know it's a conversation between two people of a certain relationship, you know which culture it is, right? So then suddenly the words you use can be very, very different, right? And that will allow just much better quality. And translation, first, if you think about French principles, it's a quality thing, right? Nobody will use AI if it's not high quality. But that's where I stand and I say, I do believe that context awareness will give a leap to quality. Will it reach 100%? Probably not. But if we're currently at 50, we can get to 80.
Nice.
Yeah.
So earlier you talked about too how the output of the models is only going to be as good as the data upon which it's trained. So it's something that I'm looking at right now is taking and building knowledge bases essentially to be layered atop of large language models. Do you think that's something that could improve the quality of the output if you're taking and, for example, some of the things that people talk about is that when we're looking at the data on the internet, it's biased, right? It's certainly biased towards English. It's certainly biased if we think about, there's a paper by Timnit Gebru and a few other people where they talk about the fact that it's biased towards generally younger men from developed countries writing in English. And so that's an area of bias within the models. And so do you think that building up like a specialized knowledge base, for example, if I build one in content on translation and localization, layer that atop the LLMs, is that something that's potentially going to get me more accurate output when asking the model about topics related to translation and localization?
100%. 100%. Like if you have an application in a certain language, like as you said, I don't remember exactly the number. Was it 95% of the internet is in English?
Yeah.
And so the model is so much better in English than anything else. Yeah. And it's normal. Think of yourself as a student that you spend 35 hours out of 40 a week studying English and then 5 hours studying other languages. What do you think you're going to be doing? You're going to be speaking English much better. So in your scenario, if you're doing any types of text localization or translation to another language, obviously the first thing you want to do is test the baseline. Maybe it is good enough. Maybe it will not be as good as English, but maybe it's going to be good enough. Then there's other techniques. For example, you can fine tune your own model. You can take the existing GPT-4, for example, or like other models, and you can do what we call fine tuning, meaning you make it very good for a specific use case, right? So if you're, for example, let's say translating healthcare websites into Spanish, right? It uses a very specific terminology. It uses specific words, right? So what you can do is if you have data from your past experience, from friends, from family, from someone that you know, what you can do is take the LLM as it is and say, okay, I'm fine-tuning it for this particular scenario. Here are the words. Here are examples, and it will do a better job at that, especially considering like the knowledge you give it.
What is fine-tuning? Because I hear it used different ways.
Yeah.
What is it?
It's essentially specializing the model in a particular use case. So LLMs, you can call it as it's like, I know everything. I'm a generalist, right? Mm-hmm. But you may have knowledge that it doesn't have. maybe you have some specific data that it doesn't have. So let me give you a concrete example. At Revolut, what we needed to do was we were working on computer vision models to onboard users. So users, when they onboarded into Revolut, they took a picture of their passport and a selfie, and we extracted all the information so that they don't have to manually input it. That's what we did. That's what our team did.
Awesome.
Now, we didn't use LLMs because LLMs were not a thing at the time. This was 2019. But we had the concept of fine-tuning because IDs from Mexico, IDs from France, IDs from the UK are very different. So you cannot have one model that works on everything.
Yep.
So that's what we call, you fine-tune a model on Mexican data, and you call that Mexican model.
Yeah.
You fine-tune a model on French, and you call it French model. And then depending on the input that comes in, you route the model. So it's essentially, we make it very good for a particular use case. And so that's what fine-tuning is about. You make it, you don't need to use LLMs for for your use case. You can just make it very good for yours. And usually it leads to better output if you give it good data.
I ask because sometimes I've heard the word fine-tuning be used to talk about like adjusting parameters and things like that. And other times I've heard it be used to talk about, what is the human reward model? So I forget the acronym right now.
Was it reinforcement learning?
Yeah, reinforcement learning. And so I was just wondering, is that like, are those both good examples of fine-tuning?
So fine-tuning, I will say it is, sure. I mean, it depends how you look at it. So for the first one, it is absolutely true, because when you talk about parameters, it's exactly what it does. What you're doing is you're taking a model and you're changing the parameters to fit your use case. Because a model is just a bunch of parameters. Again, 700 billion or 70 billion, 70 billion parameters. So you're changing those parameters to fit that use case. So completely accurate. The second one is a bit more broad. Reinforcement learning is a way of training models. It's not necessarily fine-tuning. It's just a different way of training models by replicating how, for example, animals learn. So the way you teach a dog is, if it does a good thing, you give it food. If it does a bad thing, I don't know, you scream at it, or I don't know what people do. It's exactly the same thing. You give it a reward for doing something good, and you give it a negative reward for doing something bad. It's used a lot in gaming, for example, to create like bots, to create agents that can, if it kills an enemy, you give it plus. If it doesn't kill an enemy and it dies, you give it minus. And then it learns to do that. But it's not necessarily fine-tuning.
Sometimes I think people use the terminology and they're just picking terms too that they think are going to impress their clients. And so they're like, let's just call this, let's just say we're doing fine tuning and just using the buzzwords and things like that.
And in the context of large language models, when you fine tune it, some people use the term small language models, which are specific, like just specialized large language models. So those can be used usually interchangeably, maybe not from the technical side, but at least when you speak. And so small language models is like, hey, a specialized large language model, and a fine-tuned is also a specialized large language model.
Okay.
Yeah.
So data science has been a big part of your work.
Oh, yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about the characteristics of a strong multilingual data source and data analysis techniques that can be applied to improve multilingual content production through machine and human translation?
What do you mean about multilingual stores?
I mean, for example, in thinking about this idea of knowledge bases that would be layered atop of the large language models, would all of the multilingual content be put together? Would it be separate knowledge bases, one for each language? What would it look like to go through and prepare those data sources for integration with the large language model?
That's a good question. So when it comes to this, the answer is you experiment and see. And that's what a data scientist does. They set a hypothesis and they test it. And they use data for that. And they use data-driven methods for that. So, for example, a good data scientist can be like, oh, I am trying to translate from, let's say, English to some less common language. Let's say I come from Tunisia. We have a dialect called Tunisian, which is not used outside of Tunisia. But let's assume we want to translate from English to Tunisian. And you try, and it doesn't work very well. So what do? A data scientist's job is to say, okay, I have a hypothesis. by adding, maybe by fine-tuning an LLM on Tunisian data, I can make it better. So their job usually would be, for example, hey, I'm gonna go and try to find as much data from Tunisian as I possibly can. Maybe from like YouTube videos, maybe from, I don't know, some data that wasn't publicly available, but you had to go through an API endpoint. And so LLMs don't have access to it because it's not publicly available.
Mhm.
And then quickly build a method to, hey, fine tune really quickly and test. Does it work better? And so a big part is, and I think the hard part, and this is something that we need to touch on as we speak about LLMs and translation, is evaluation of LLMs. So what we call eval. Eval is a big problem because generative models do not output a confidence value. Usually machine learning will output a confidence which will tell you how good the prediction is.
Mhm.
LLMs in their architecture don't do that. So you don't know how good it is. So part of the data science work is, hey, okay, so I have taken the data from the Tunisian, let's say, in this case, data, I fine-tuned the model. They prepare a test set, maybe a translation, like maybe 100 translations from like English to Tunisian that they have done manually, and then they compare. How did it fit before? How did it compare before compared to now? Usually you set a goal. Let's say I want to get 95% there. Maybe the previous method was 60%. Now it's 80%. So you analyze, why is it not 95%? And you look at the data, you're like, maybe every sentence that contains humor is not working properly. So you add more humor data and retry. Maybe you go from 80 to 85 and then you refine, right? So it's that whole setting up hypothesis. You start with baseline, in this case, like straight away LLMs. You say, okay, I believe data will improve this. You get the data, you try, you measure, you try again, and you measure until you reach your goal. Is how this is a typical work of a data scientist, right? Is to set up hypotheses, use data, and then set up the entire framework to test it, and then come up with like business insights, for example. Yeah.
So then when you're compiling together the data that you're gonna integrate with the large language model, what does that look like too? I imagine it's a lot of like tagging content with this is from, for example, something I'm looking at when building knowledge bases, and I think about building a knowledge base from the perspective of building a special language corpus, which would be just the terminology that I'm using within the field of terminology, where some of the things that we're told is that, first of all, we need to have, generally a starter corpus needs to have something like 100,000 words. It can have such little content because it packs a lot more punch in terms of like actual content, I guess, actual, like, I don't know, just specialized meaning that's being conveyed. To be considered reliable, it needs to be unbiased. So things that I would need to do is I would need to track things like, okay, I'm building a corpus on translation and localization. I'm not going to just include content that was written by TransPerfect, because then I have a corpus that is about TransPerfect. It's not about translation and localization broadly. I also need to do things like go through and see, okay, if I'm building a corpus about translation and localization, it needs to cover things like management, technology, language. It needs to cover all of these, vendor management, quality management. So I need to go through and make sure that I'm tagging the data. So what does, I guess when you're doing the data science piece and you're building up resources, how do you do that quickly when you're wanting to build a resource that's also reliable?
I mean, this is a big thing. I think there's entire companies just helping people do this. So it's not like it's not, I wouldn't say it's not an unsolved problem, but it's like a thing that people do all the time. So what you're talking about is a lot about like diversity of data. For example, let's say like one of the issues we had when I was doing face recognition at Revolut was training models on people from different ethnicities and from different continents to make sure that it works as well across different, because otherwise the model gets biased. Mm-hmm. So if you're a data scientist and you're building a data set, this is the problem of what we call data imbalance. and data balance. You want to make sure that your data is balanced across everything that you're looking for. So in your case, in this case, if you have like different categories, and usually the best way is to categorize like kind of data that you want. Let's say I want the data from this particular category, this data from this particular category. What you want to do is make sure that the data points that you get is balanced across different categories. So if you have 5 categories, you want to have 10,000 from each. If you have 10,000 from category 1 and you have 100 from category 5, your generative model will bias towards category 1. And so it is up to the data scientist's work to make sure that when they fetch the data, it's like, oh, keep track of what we call data balance, because otherwise your model would be biased, right? It is the same thing as, again, if we take the example of students. If you are trying to teach a student about the difference between cat and dog, and let's say, I don't know, a snake, if I give you like 1,000 images of a cat, 1,000 images of a dog, and 2 images of a snake, you will not do a good job at recognizing a snake because you've been trained a lot more on cats and dogs. Similarly here, if you have like different categories of data, let's say you're trying to solve something that contains, there's a lot of different categories. You want to make sure that your data is balanced across all different categories. So one way to approach that is, hey, I curate a data set of 1,000 words, images, whatever it is that, in this case, words, let's say, maybe 1,000 sentences of this particular category, test it. If it works well, move to the next, and then assess how it works on the first, how it works like for category 1 as well. Like you want to test category 1, add data for category 2, test category 2, but also retest category 1, because you don't know how things might, influence each other. But a lot of this work, like there's no right or wrong. There's things to not do, like make sure that your data is balanced, is like, as a no-brainer. But a lot of it is hypothesis. And I could try to like tell you that, oh, hey, you do this, but ultimately it depends on the data. It depends on the use case, and you just have to experiment really fast. Because machine learning models and LLMs, sadly, they are black boxes. We don't really know what's happening under the hood, right? You can see it, you can visualize it. It's very complex. So it's about really like setting up a framework to test really, really fast and experiment as much as you possibly can.
Thank you for that. I'm curious, because your background is so vast. It covers so many different like subject fields and use cases. You've created a game, for example, that people can use sign language to play chess. You've just done such interesting projects and work. How did you get interested in translation and localization?
Oh, yeah, great question. Great question. So I come from Tunisia. And in Tunisia, we speak French, Arabic, and dialect Tunisian. I had the chance to live in the Netherlands. I had the chance to live in Switzerland after that, and now I live in London. I really, really appreciate cultures. It really matters to me. And why I got into localization, there's this part which I care a lot about cultures. But to me, it's about breaking cultural barriers. As I said earlier, I don't think it's fair that someone who doesn't speak English from Tunisia cannot access the same amount of information and content the same way that I do. Yeah. I don't think it's fair. And localization is the way that it's achieved today. And I heard game studios tell me that they don't localize to Arabic because it's hard from a technical standpoint. What does that mean? It means that I have some people in my network who only speak Arabic that cannot access those games because it's hard to implement from a technical side. And so I find localization fascinating. And from a technical standpoint, it enables people to live. It's about delivering experiences that feel native to everybody. And I find that just fascinating because the way I view the world is not the same at all as someone from Mexico or from China or from Japan that view the world. And I think experiences, and I care a lot about experiences, I care a lot about immersive experiences, they should be personalized. Maybe not to every person because that would be like nearly impossible, or it's like very hard, but at least to the culture. Some things are unacceptable in a country that are in another. And it's just fascinating to tackle that problem. I think had I not been from Tunisia and speaking multiple languages fluently and living in different countries, maybe I would view this differently, but I just find it fascinating. And actually, my favorite book is called The Culture Map. You may not know it, or you may know it, but it's about how different cultures interact. Incredible book, by the way, incredible book. And it tells you, for example, the difference between British and Dutch. And it's just fascinating because now when a British person tells me something, I understand more what they actually say versus compared to a Dutch person, for example, right? Even if the words are completely different.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I think a lot. I haven't read that book. I will include it when I publish this talk on YouTube. I'll include a link to it in the description. But I think it's fascinating too because translators are, or essentially the task of translation is to navigate meaning, whatever that is, on like 5 different levels at least. And
Yeah,
one of them is the pragmatic level where it's like what's not said that people understand with words,
yeah,
like
yeah.
sarcasm, or I just find that so fascinating that, even when, like, how do you say no in a culture? Because some cultures you wouldn't directly say no, other cultures you would directly say no. So
Exactly.
I agree, it's fascinating.
And it
Uh,
goes beyond words. Colors can be completely different. What white is for, if I believe white for Western is how red is in East Asia.
hmm,
And so, you know how wedding websites are always white, for example, in Western. It doesn't make sense if it's white in China.
yeah,
So it goes beyond words. It's also visuals,
yeah.
right? But yeah.
And so what takeaways do you have, or like when you think about your path from the previous work that you've done in machine learning and
Yeah.
creating models and implementing models and things like that, what takeaways from that work do you apply now that you're working in translation and localization?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, for example, one of the things that I'm working on is localization QA. So it is checking that the localization is well done. So there is the task of what happens is, if you're a game studio or any studio, usually you will send your texts to a vendor. The vendor will send back results to the game. And then the game has like now the spreadsheet with like 15 different columns. For every English sentence, they have them like in 15 different columns.
Yeah.
And they need to make sure that it fits well in the game. So, for example, German is usually longer than English, the words in German. I spoke a bit of German and I know that. And people have been telling me that it's a massive problem because games usually have like some level of UI, let's say like a button.
Yeah.
The English word is longer than English, the German word is longer than English. So when they put it inside the game, it goes outside of the box. As a player, that will break the flow. It's like, it's weird. But first of all, it breaks the flow, but also it feels like it wasn't designed for you, right? It's like, oh, they forgot about me. So players don't like that. And so one of the things that I'm doing right now, which uses my work from the past, is what we call visual LQA. It's, hey, given this image of this language, does it look? Does it look okay? Usually visual LQA is about answering 3 questions. Does it look good? Does it say what it's supposed to say? Does it fit the context? The last one is a bit hard. The last one is where I think really frontier of the tech, because you need to understand context and where LLMs really help. But the first two, especially the first one, does it look good, is purely a computer vision, like a problem.
Yeah.
It's like, hey, does it look okay? And so my work at Revolut was a lot about like understanding images and extracting data from it. And I'm actually doing exactly the same thing here. It's just applying it to a different use case.
I was going to ask, so you are, according to your LinkedIn profile, you're in stealth mode at your new
Yeah.
company. And so I just out of curiosity wanted to ask if you want to talk about at all the work that you're doing now in your new company. And I completely understand if you say, no, I
Oh
didn't.
no, I'm happy. To be totally fair, the reason why I put like stealth mode is just I didn't take the time to design a proper website and a proper. I'm focused on
You're
like
just
building the
working.
actual product.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
exactly. So it's not really a stealth mode. I'm happy to talk about it, but essentially, yeah. So to kind of like reiterate what I've been saying during the podcast, during this call, and right now, you know, I care about like cultural adaptation of content. And I believe that cultural barriers should not exist anymore. It's crazy to me that they do. And so as we are speaking to studios and businesses, we discovered how they currently do it, which is localization, right? And initially, I wanted, like my co-founder and I wanted to kind of like semi-automate localization, like make it very easy for businesses to do localization. But over time, I discovered that honestly, there's a few problems with that. Localization, the choice of words is very subjective. And it's very hard to measure how good localization is. Usually, if you ask game studios how they localize, like how good the localization is, some people will tell you it's based on feel. Does it feel right? Doesn't feel right. So it was very hard to build a business around something that is not very easy to measure. And what we are doing right now, instead of doing localization, as I mentioned, we're doing localization QA. So it turns out that every business that localizes content, we've been speaking to people at Netflix, people at Salesforce, people at HubSpot, people in gaming studios. They get back the result, and they need to have someone from every native language checking that everything is okay, right? It's not about localization, it's about checking that everything is okay. And you're checking on multiple layers. You're checking the visual, you're checking the linguistic, you're checking the context, you're checking that it's legal. For example, there was a game in 2012 that got banned from the UAE because it had nudity. So someone did not do the proper check. And so they lost millions of dollars, right? So here we are solving that problem. It's like maybe tomorrow you don't need to hire someone from every native language to just tell you if it looks good, if it's fine. Like we want to automate the entire thing. And for game studios, for example, they don't need to have someone playing the game in every single language to check. Maybe you can play only in English, and we use AI to capture the image, replace the text by the translated text, and tell you in advance if there would have been a problem or not, right? So it's about automating LQA. And what we believe is this is a problem that everybody has been complaining about. We had multiple businesses from different industries. They were like, we would buy this yesterday. But it wasn't possible until today to do it properly because the technology just wasn't there. You need very, very strong model to tell you if something is wrong visually. And then what happens is people usually write bug reports based on what they see. So they look at a screenshot or they play a video, they see something is wrong, they draw a bounding box, and then they write a bug report. When they write a bug report, the developer goes and changes it and fixes it. That's where LLMs come in. If I give an LLM a screenshot with a bounding box of an issue, it can generate a great bug report for me, right? It wasn't possible before to generate a good bug report for me. So that's what we're betting on. So we're betting that localization QA is a huge problem and people want to solve it. And this is a validation that we had. And so we want to automate the whole flow. And what I find fascinating is today it's a problem of words, but it is increasingly becoming a problem of audio. More and more experiences are audio-based. Think of the future of immersive experiences, gestures. Gestures are not the same in different language, in different cultures. I don't know, I don't have specific examples, but I know that in some cultures, the yes is a no in other cultures. So how do you make sure that people do not misinterpret that, right? And so I think there's a lot of really interesting, both technology, but also business here, because the volume is massive. You are talking about every single company that does localization, multiplied by the number of features they release, multiplied by the number of languages they translate it to, or they localize to. And you need to run checks on all of that. So that's why the company name is Native, because it's about delivering experiences that feel native to everybody.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I think I can see how much it's related to your values and your mission of just not having people having to wait a very long time to get access to games and experiences that other people have access to immediately. And not to mention making things available in many more languages much more quickly.
Exactly.
I'm maybe going to ask you one more question that's a question that I had, and then I'll see if there's any last comments that you want to make. So for translation and localization companies who are interested in getting into like machine learning and implementing language models, we're lucky to be talking to you because you've built so many teams. Like you've been the person building up the teams who do this. What do you look for when building up a team capable of doing all of this stuff around machine learning? And what sort of tips would you give for people when integrating large language models into the work?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I've had the chance to hire quite a lot. And so it really depends on the stage of the company. Um, I like to look for people who have done projects on the side. So I've had lots of applicants, for example, that I pick for interview, and then, it depends on the interview stage, and that depends on the interview how it goes. But I really like seeing people that have, for example, if they were students that build things on the side, and more specifically, not only build them, but also put them out. Because a lot of people are like, yeah, I built this project, LLM or non-LLM, doesn't matter. And it's on GitHub. And that's it. And the code is there. GitHub is where people store code. It's there. And I'm like, okay, so if I want to test your project, I need to go on GitHub, read the code, understand it, get it out. Versus the person who tells me, here's a link. And today, it's very easy to put things out. There's a lot of tools like Streamlit, like Vercel, where you can just put things out. So I prefer someone who does something very small, put it out, and solves a real problem. Like, for example, one thing I did, which I did 2 years ago, was LLMs just came out, became a thing. And I saw a lot of people saying, oh, I use it to generate emails. Of course, it makes sense to generate emails. So I built a really quick tool, very easy. Put the first name of the person, occupation, why you're reaching out. That's it, right? And some comments about you. Generate, and it gives you an email. And then copy paste. I've had maybe 2,000, 3,000 people using it. But that's like a small thing that's out there. Everybody can use. Project, very small. That's much better than trying to build the big thing, but never actually putting it out, right?
Yeah.
So I look a lot for that because it's really, when you're looking for, at least in startups, maybe big tech companies are different, but at least in startups, you're looking for people that can do things autonomously and put them out in production because you want people that really bring value to the company. And doing just research in a startup and just never putting things out never really happens. So by seeing that someone built a project, got an idea, built a project, put it out, it's probably one of the things that I look for the most, right? And obviously, like, there's the cultural fit, but that's really dependent on the person. I cannot really give general advice on cultural fit because it's very, very subjective. But on CVs, I think that's one thing that goes out for me for a lot. So if you're really interested in machine learning and LLMs, try to find something that people struggle at. Maybe we're talking about translation from English to you. If you come from a country where your language is not spoken so much, translation is bad. You curate your own data set. You fine-tune your own model. And suddenly you make translation go from 70 to 90%. Yeah. And like, wow, this person figured out that, went all the way to try to get the data set and improve it because they cared so much about this. I'm like, that's the kind of things that will be like straight away a 4 out of 4 or whatever metric that people use. Right?
Yeah.
Just a tip. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much for your time today. I think I could probably ask many more questions, but we're approaching the hour. Are there any last thoughts that you'd like to share on machine learning, localization, translation? Yeah, any conclusions you would share? Anything we haven't talked about that you would want to talk about?
I think, look, I've had the chance to be speaking to lots of people in the localization space, and lots of people are completely against AI. And it feels more like an emotional reaction rather than a rational reaction.
Yeah.
I think the world is changing completely. And I'm not talking about, oh, you're able to generate text. Like the work I did at Revolut for a year can be literally replaced by 3 lines of code today. We spent so much time building, fine-tuning models for every single ID that today I give it to GPT-4, one call does the job for me. And so that's what I mean by the world is changing. Businesses are changing. Things are going to be much faster, much cheaper. I would just say, I think it's important to learn how to leverage these tools. And instead of being like, I reject AI, it's more like, now that it's here, what can I do with it? And you've touched earlier on something very interesting, Elena, about the volume of things that people can translate. So can people do something with that? The mindset is the world is changing. What can I do with it? Right? It won't take the jobs of it will reduce the workload of a lot of people, but I think some people will be smart and try to position themselves, see it as a positive thing and try to position themselves. I think it's a very important mentality to have. Once a new technology is democratized the way that LLMs are, it changes a lot of things, and I think we need to just like leverage it more than reject it. For example, if the people that rejected the internet in 2000, it would probably maybe they would have built something incredible had they not rejected it. Like I don't know, but it's just worth like having a mindset shift when it comes to this. Is just my final closing remark.
That's a great closing remark. I just did a course at MIT on generative AI, and Dr. Abel Sanchez, his piece of advice was, first of all, it's not too late to pick up the tools. Like when I took the course, I was feeling like, oh no, if I don't do something, I might get left behind. And it was, first of all, really encouraging to hear it's not too late. And his big piece of advice was just touch the tools. Like try to learn as quickly as possible and touch the tools. So yeah, thank
100%.
thank you so much for your time today, Ahmed. We really appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule
My
to
pleasure.
share so much knowledge and insight with us.
Yeah, my pleasure. Always a pleasure to help. Thank you very much for hosting and for asking really great questions.
You're very welcome. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.